If you like what you're seeing and hearing, please consider subscribing to the podcast. You can go to either Apple iTunes, the Google Play Store, Spotify, or Amazon Music in the podcast section. It'll hit Monday morning or Sunday afternoon, depending on when it posts. And the video will hit on YouTube and Spotify Monday. Spotify will hit Monday evening, and YouTube it'll hit Monday morning, 7 a.m., just like it does for the audio services. So please go to those places and consider subscribing or listening to the show. You can also write to me at gwgpodfellows@gmail.com if you want to write me a letter. Let me know what you think of the show, things like that. Or you can also find me on Twitter at JustLittleJoe. So go to those places and please consider liking and subscribing. Thanks. And with that, we'll get on to the episode. Hello, my name is Joseph Carlson, and this is episode 228 of Gaming with Grief. And I'm calling this episode, I guess, Andrew Huberman and, reacting to grief. I haven't really come up with a title. It'll be in the description. I don't really know what I'm going to call this one. But many times, as I have reviewed, grief or dealt with grief or stuff like that, I have examined, like, Psychology Today. There was an article in New York Times talking about complicated grief, which I'll talk about today. And Dr. Huberman, Andrew Huberman, who's a well-known podcaster, he teaches, I'm just going to read this. He's a well-known podcaster. He's done a lot of stuff. He's been a guest on many podcasts that I listen to. I'm just going to read this from his website, hubermanlab.com. Andrew Huberman has a P.H.D. and is a neuroscientist and tenured professor in the Department of Neurobiology and, by courtesy, Psychiatric and Behavioral Sciences at Stanford School of Medicine. He has numerous significant contributions to the fields of brain development, brain function, and neuroplasticity, which is the ability of our nervous system to rewire and learn new behavior skills and cognitive function. They go on to talk about his award. He teaches at Stanford, and he's got a podcast. And I want to talk about one of the episodes of the podcast. It's episode 74. And it's called The Science and Process of Healing from Grief. So you can go on YouTube and watch that episode there. I don't think I'm going to link it in the description. It's episode 74 of his thing. He's a well-known podcaster. This came out like 2 years ago, and I just hit my feed now. I guess I was looking up enough stuff about grief. To be honest, I talked to a lot of friends about this. They said the best way to experience this episode is just to listen to it, because it is 2 hours of him staring at the camera, talking about grief, bringing up studies. Now, this isn't where I'm going to dunk on Andrew Huberman or anything like that. I just, as someone who, this is obviously a very clinical look at grief and complex grief and complicated grief and what happens to your body when you go through grief and things like that, things to alleviate certain symptoms of grief. I think all that is fascinating. But there's things that he kept bringing up that I don't, not that I don't understand, but I think it literally looks good in a paper, but doesn't really help you in the long run. But let me just go over the podcast again. It's called The Science and Process of Healing from Grief. It's episode 74 of the Huberman Lab podcast. And you know what? I should probably tell you when it came out. But you know what? Just look. It's number 74. Look that up. He said that basically, this is the part that I found really interesting, is that, we as humans know other human beings or animals or something like that in a physical space. So, I know of my parents or my friends or my family, whatever. I know of them physically. So when they are gone, your brain really literally has to be rewired to experience that in a new way. And I think I didn't even think of that it is an actual thing that happens in your brain. You think of emotions a lot, of like, I miss this person, or this person wronged me, or, I had a bad interaction with someone the day before. But the fact that your brain has to be rewired to redo circuitry to consider people in different places, I thought was like simply crazy. And not crazy, and not out of the realm of possibility, but it just, again, I'm not here to dunk on Andrew Huberman. He's obviously a renowned professor, and he brought in many studies in the 2 hours of the podcast that I listened to him. But, you just don't think of it like that, because you're so caught up in the emotional part of grief that you don't think that there's actually something happening in your brain. And I enjoyed that part of him saying, listen, this is what's happened to your brain when you were in grief. And I thought that was just kind of pretty amazing that he laid it out. He also did talk about complicated grief, which I've talked about before. I mentioned at the top of the episode. And he said later on that it does get difficult to try to, the different lines in the therapeutic writings and things of this. It's difficult to draw a line between what would be considered like normal grief, complicated grief. I'm trying to think what their lines they call it. I took some notes. Let's see here. Rational grieving is what they call it. Like, so what are the lines between those things? One other thing I thought was very fascinating was he said mentally, I took notes. I didn't write every technical term down, but there's something about grief in your brain which is motivational because it's seeking to find something that you are missing. So it pushes you in a direction to, I guess, like fill a void maybe that these people in your life are not filling anymore because they're obviously not there. So if you can rewrite your brain, now this is all what I'm inferring. This isn't what he's saying. I'm just kind of like talking about. So if your brain infers these things and you have to rewrite your brain, then you have to be pushed to do something out of the ordinary, which I really was kind of inspirational in a way because going to therapy with my wife and the grief we went through, you think to yourself, you're stuck in a rut and you think to yourself, I'm not going to get out of this hole. I've talked about it as a hole before, but like in a way you're being pushed in a direction to, and I guess hopefully, I don't think I'm going through it anymore, but if you get pushed in the right direction, then you can maybe do something positive about it. So I thought, that was really fascinating. I know I just paused for a second. I think that's good. They see, he said in a way, you're craving that love that you used to get, which makes sense to me. He kept bringing up complicated grief over and over again. You have a desire in your region because something I kind of mentioned that. One thing I thought that he didn't bring up, which I thought was very interesting, was he keeps talking about having to rewrite your brain in the past and what you've experienced. But like Nora McInerney of Terrible Thanks for Asking brings up a long time, it isn't just the past memories that you hold on to, that you cling to. It's the future idea of what you had with that person, with I was going to have kids. That has changed. My relationship with that has changed. My parents, no longer can I call my parents to, if I experience something or have a question, I can no longer call them and talk to them. So I have to rewire my brain how I deal with certain situations. Like if I have a bad day, I can call my wife, but I've talked about many times, and my therapist talked about, your relationship with people are different. So you can't just reach out to someone that in a way like a friend, because friends will say that all the time. I'm here for you, man. Tell me, if you need to unload, that's fine. And to an extent that's true, but like, do they have the capacity, and are you in the same type of relationship with your friends that you are with your family? I'd say no. Unless I've talked about before, if you have a bad relationship with your family, if your family is abusive and you've stepped away from them, then you may be able to fill that void with your friends. But like really, what does that do? Anyway, I think you interact with people on different wavelengths, for lack of a better term. And I think having to do that is, it's something that you have to like reconcile when you're redoing these things in your brain to say like, this person is no longer around. One thing I also thought was interesting was he said, your brain relies on experience, not knowledge. So all the knowledge you gain is kind of ancillary to your personal experience, which is something that I've talked about in my other podcast I do with Avin Carroll, the political podcast, about some people, when you give them facts and figures, that's penultimate. That's the best thing, because I can look at 20% of people do this, 40% of people do this. We live in a majority society, so the 40% of people that want to do this, that's what we're going to do. because other people are undecided, whatever. But then you talk to other people and these anecdotes. I was just talking to someone and they said X. I was talking to this person over here. They said Y. That means more to me than anything else. And I find those kind of things fascinating. But like what he's saying is here through different studies, your brain relies on experience and not knowledge. So for those people, that experience of meeting that person and them saying something means more to them than the person reading and having the experience of like seeing studies and things and all that. It's to me, it kind of like coalesced into like a feeling of that. And they said grief was almost like a phantom limb. We've gone over that before. The thing I said the most is grieving is always like waves. It comes in waves. And I always thought that was like, before I went through all this, I always thought that's dumb. But it's, for me, I find it like the most true thing. That grief does come in waves and that some days are good, some days are bad. And with therapy and stuff, I've been able to examine that kind of stuff. So, yeah. And he brought up in there, which I thought was very interesting, grief and depression are two separate things completely. So they're not combined together to make, we always think that they're somehow connected. And he said they're two separate like emotional things. I want to say in the hippocampus, but maybe I didn't write that down. And he talked about the vagal tone. It's a pathway of nerves in your body. You can train yourself to breathe and like release stress and stuff like that, which could help with grief, which I thought was kind of neat. He also talked about studies that were done with people that like my therapist did, where it was very much, write a letter to your deceased parents. I did that for a bit. It was difficult, but I don't know if it's because I knew the trick. I knew what was coming. Yeah, I don't know. And the end, he talked about moving through grief at a reasonable rate. I don't know what that is. I would say that it's maybe through therapy or tools or whatever that you're able to contextualize how you're feeling and know what's happening when it's happening. So you maybe don't overreact or react in a negative way, maybe to yourself and people around you. I'm thinking maybe. I don't know. To me, the phrase move through grief at a reasonable rate is, again, something that sounds very good on paper, but I've said many times on this podcast, for many people, grief is not an abstract exercise. People experience grief in their lives. People they love pass away. So it's really where the metal meets the road, where you can read about grief and, talk about how difficult everything will be. But like when it actually happens, that's when. He even brings up the example of, I think, a physicist who is very rational, won a lot of awards, but his wife passes away. So then he has to deal with the fact that all these logical things in his life with figures and math and making the natural world make sense kind of don't make sense when you're dealing with an emotional response to someone that you deeply care about, in this case, the physicist's wife's passing away. And he talked about rational grieving, which I mentioned before, but like, again, is a strange concept to me. I don't understand what rational grieving is. I guess it would be, again, if you don't harm yourself or others, but you're experiencing grief, I guess would be one definition of it. I'm not sure. I had a lot of technical problems this week, so this will be a little bit shorter episode. But I did enjoy the clinical look at grief from Andrew Huberman. Again, it's Huberman Lab. It's episode 74 of his podcast. It's called The Science and Process of Healing from Grief. Please go to that YouTube channel, support Andrew Huberman. He has about 4 million subscribers. And, people, there was really good comments in the comment section. I am Joseph Carlson. This is the end of the episode. Thank you for joining me, and I will probably see you guys next week.